This state is not shown on the world map, but its territory is equal to that of Luxembourg. You won't see any passers-by in the streets of the towns and villages of this state. Wild animals are the real masters of this lifeless wasteland. This country's residents are prohibited from catching fish or even gathering firewood in the forest. They made their choice, and now they live in isolation by law. This is an old tree transplanted. It'll hardly take root in a new place. Population of this state depends on the hour of the day. In the morning, a commuter train running to the capital is completely full. The zone is like a lens. It magnifies all the good and all the bad in a person. The best thing a tourist can bring with them to this state is a dosimeter, especially for those who are walking through its capital. It's still uneasy to live in the capital of this country. On its central square, near a concrete mausoleum, the gamma radiation level is up to 30 times higher than in Moscow. Can you guess the name of this country? It has an environment, laws, and a way of life all its own. Not surprisingly, because of this, everyone on Earth has known about this place for at least a quarter of a century. Let's take a tour of this mysterious land to Chernobyl. These are the southern gates to the state of Chernobyl. Checkpoint Dityatki. Behind this gate lies the seclusion zone, which lives by its own rules. The laws of this land might seem quite weird to an ordinary person. You won't find the state of Chernobyl on any political world map, though its boundaries are clearly marked on the billboards near the checkpoint at the crossing of the 30-kilometer zone border. Now, the Ukrainian part of the seclusion zone is 214 kilometers of barbed wire. The zone itself spans 60 kilometers from west to east and 40 kilometers from north to south, totaling 2,500 square kilometers. In 1986, after the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, some 130,000 people fled the zone. Today, one can only enter the zone legally by one of two ways: by car through the checkpoints in the south, north, and west, or on a commuter train from Slavutich, where about 8,000 workers and their families live. There are about 3,400 people who will work at the plant, of whom 1,000 people only work to maintain controlled access areas, barriers to prevent radioactive materials from spreading beyond the plant's limits, beyond the zone's boundaries. The first people you see when trying to enter the zone aren't Ukrainian police officers, but health physicians. No special license plates will get you into the zone automatically. If an instrument shows that you have an excessive content of radionucleotides in your car, then it is immediately sent for decontamination, and the driver is seriously interrogated. This isn't all done just to scare people, it's done for their safety. People who breach the regulations could actually face a court trial. Normally they are just fined first. If the breach of the law reoccurs, we will press criminal charges. The first few kilometers within the state of Chernobyl, no signs of the apocalypse are beyond the window. All we see is just a thawed spring forest and lifeless houses, which don't differ in appearance much from a village in any part of Russia. Along the way, our dosimeter reads 0.12, 0.16 microsieverts per hour. That corresponds to the natural background gamma radiation level and doesn't pose any danger. The zone, in a way, is like a matryoshka doll. There's two more security areas to go through. These are a 10-kilometer wide zone and a special zone in it. This special zone is where there are spots of higher radiation levels. This is the zone where the capital of the state of Chernobyl is, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, with its collapsed fourth reactor under its sarcophagus. This is our destination. It is here where we are going to get answers to the most typical questions that people ask when they hear the word Chernobyl. What is going on in this mysterious zone? How dangerous is the collapsed reactor today? Could another tragedy happen here in the future? If one believes in rumors and the imagery in video games, the state of Chernobyl is inhabited by mutants and madmen, and deadly radiation doses are at every turn. Therefore, while we approach the city, we're getting a sinking feeling in our stomachs. We expected to see lifeless blocks of Soviet apartments, wild animals, but at the entrance to Chernobyl, we just saw some construction workers. They were calmly repairing the city's main attraction. Today, there are several hundred permanent residents in Chernobyl, but the main population is shift workers. They are residents of Kiev and neighboring regions and work at city facilities, in community utilities, and at scientific laboratories of Ukraine's research institutes. Life of a shift worker goes 15 days in the zone, 15 days out, or 4 days in the zone, 3 days out.
Дня в зоне, 3 дома.
Там дальше в огороде.
There in the market garden, I plant potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, cucumbers, onions, radishes. Oh, I plant everything. Yeah? Yeah, I've actually got about 1,900 square meters to work with. Not bad. All this land with a house, 1,900 square meters, all legal on paper, bars. Sometimes they call Chernobyl a squad republic, and this is no accident. Here is the exact place where most of the locals who didn't move away from home sweet home a quarter of a century ago live. Estimates say there are some 130 people. Well, I don't really know if you should pity me exactly. I mean, the question is, where would they evacuate us to? I mean, they evacuated us to Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk, Ukraine's dirtiest city. So we came here. We don't want to be in that Dnipro-Dzerzhinsk. We got sick there. We became homesick. We wanted to come back to where we're from. A year after the accident, authorities gave in to the stubbornness of the squatters. Now they live in the zone on their own with no problems. Here is the river we have, Urochishe. It branches to the Uzh, yeah, and to the Pripyat. In summer, it's a real beauty here. Water lilies everywhere. If you put down a net, you might get some fish. If you got a fishing pole, you'll surely get lucky. Really? Yeah, it's no problem. The law prohibits catching fish, gathering mushrooms and berries, or selling vegetables and fruits planted in the state of Chernobyl. It's a criminal offense if you get caught, but locals are running the risk, while scientists study the isotopic diet. Regarding vegetables, there's an excess of strontium everywhere. You know, we trace these fruits and vegetables, and they all exceed the recommended guidelines for strontium content. We think the foodstuffs planted by the squatters is not acceptable for eating. We decided to check out whether it is safe or not to live and eat within the 30-kilometer seclusion area. Galina Fyodorovna gave us some of her moonshine and pickles. This is for you. Thanks. This is my favorite salad that I make. It's got cucumbers and sweet peppers and some rice. But was all this stuff planted here? Everything's planted here. Thanks. We'll check these out in our lab. One more feature of dining in the state of Chernobyl, each citizen can check for free his or her diet in the local radiological lab. The spectrometry analysis takes several hours to determine the contents of the radionuclides in the foodstuffs. Scientists say that the accident resulted in an uneven contamination. It's very scattered, though the first boundaries of the mandatory resettlement area were drawn voluntarily by the country's leaders. Well, I said the extreme point would be about 30 kilometers. Just, you know, draw a radius by compass. This is the area that would need to be resettled. Yeah, some areas got in that probably didn't need to be resettled in theory. But like I say, you know, we're in real life, and sometimes you have to draw the line. But how could you draw a clear, logical line in nature? It's just not possible. The latest studies have shown that the radioactive isotopes have decayed over 25 years. Some of them have gone deep into the ground, and now these strontium spots within the 30-kilometer zone have weakened in color to become more yellow on the radiological maps, even getting green. Elements with short lifespans have decayed, so the dose in the seclusion area is made mainly of cesium-137. The exposure dose has dropped by 3 orders of magnitude. Now it is dozens of microroentgens, but at the time of the accident, or the first day after Chernobyl, it was dozens and dozens of milliroentgens. Radioactivity is a natural phenomenon. In the world, any object, even humans, is radioactive. Therefore, nature is capable of swallowing huge doses of radiation without any human help. Radiology even has a new moniker, radiofibrillation of nature. Life has shown that today, in the most contaminated spots of the 30-kilometer zone, there is no reason for concern about the environment. No concern that it's changed or that it's permanently harmed. Man and nature are lucky, and it will be able to regain its potential one day. Getting back to the radiological laboratory of Chernobyl, they have finished testing our alcohol and food. We have checked your samples in regards to cesium and strontium. There's no excess of these elements according to the Health Ministry guidelines, so you can do whatever you want with this stuff, even eat it. You know, I think the zone should just be reopened. Let people go and live wherever they want. I mean, I stayed here, I didn't leave, and honestly, I'm living longer than a lot of people I know. Speaking about the resettlement from the Chernobyl seclusion zone, in India there are areas where the radiation level is 2 to 3 times more than in places where the people fled from the Chernobyl accident. And those people's lives were ruined by this resettlement. In the regions where they moved to, they were treated like lepers. They started to become alcoholics, and they wound up poor and isolated and alone. Just 5 minutes away from Chernobyl, and we are at the border to the 10-kilometer zone. This is the Lilev checkpoint. Now we will be traveling with a health physician who will accompany us on our journey. This is the place where the territory is most affected by radioactive fallout. Yevgeny Livenko has surveyed the local forests and industrial plots for 12 years. He knows all about the strontium and cesium spots right there in the state of Chernobyl. You can detect a significantly higher gamma radiation level just by taking one step in the wrong direction. Now we're on asphalt, and it reads 1.1 microsieverts. If we go to the curb, here at the curb, the level grows. It comes out to a dose of nearly 14 to 15 times more. Yes, these numbers are scary to anyone, but the Chernobyl plant workers say that fear goes away when you have a dosimeter, knowledge, and experience. No, I'm not afraid. I don't stay long. I just measure and leave the place. You know, the radiation isn't everywhere. It's just in spots. When our car stopped at the curb, we didn't even pay attention to the suspiciously youthful appearance of the local pine trees. Only when Yevgeny walked across the place with his dosimeter did we find out that this was the most dangerous spot in the state of Chernobyl. This is the Red Forest. It is 1 kilometer to the south of the plant site. During the first hours of the accident, this forest uptook an enormous dose of radiation. Here, the radiation level reached up to 60 roentgens per hour. This is something like 3 million times more than the natural background of Moscow. Thus, dozens of hectares of the pine forest turn red. We call the pine tree a guinea pig of radiobiology. It is an object which is subject to high exposures of radiation. It's very vulnerable. All conifers take in radioactivity by the air and through the tops of their green masses. Wind brought radioactive particles up to 100,000 square kilometers across Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. This map shows that after 4 days after the accident, an excess in radiation was noticed on 1/3 of the globe. With this, more than 80,000 square kilometers of Europe, in Austria, Germany, Finland, and Sweden, they all saw a contamination density of more than 1 curie per kilometer. Scientists believe this value is not dangerous for the average person's health. After the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the 30-kilometer-wide seclusion zone encompassed areas with more than 15 curies or greater of contamination. But in 1990, the USSR adopted the Chernobyl law. To be on the safe side, the law declared that another 60,000 square kilometers beyond the seclusion zone would be deemed radiation contaminated. Although the contamination density of this area was actually equal to the 1 or 2 curies per square kilometer that was noticed in Europe. And with that law, 8 million residents of those areas were automatically given the status of affected. As soon as this law appeared, people got the idea that they were really seriously affected and maybe sick. These are the lessons of Chernobyl. When we speak of millions being affected and declared ill by such a strange criterion that had nothing to do with real radiation safety guidelines. Generally, this stuff is all nonsense. But the real problem, the insanity, is they made it a real law in 1990. And that law made the normal situation, acceptable situation, become a catastrophe. And the catastrophe just started at that point. This is a lesson we should pay attention to. But this society we live in, where hundreds of thousands of people get money for being affected by the radiation, well, you know, it's profitable for them to speak about how awful it is and how terrible they feel and all the horrors of it. And unfortunately, I'm just afraid that this tendency will not end soon. The active phase of trying to liquidate the harmful consequences of the accident at Chernobyl fell with a change in social order. With the disintegration of the Soviet state, new forces came into politics, and they used Chernobyl for their advantage. Very many people who made decisions about Chernobyl were susceptible to the same marred public perception of radiation. They had an excessive overestimation of the radiation harm that ordinary people had. Scientists still argue about the safe exposure threshold for the general public. However, the period was placed on those disputes by the World Health Organization 5 years ago. These are citations from the WHO's report on the anniversary of the Chernobyl accident. For comparison, a high radiation dose, which is normally received by a patient during computer tomography of the whole body, is equivalent to a cumulative dose of over 20 years received by the residents of the contaminated regions after the Chernobyl accident. European scientists were more rational in treating the consequences of the Chernobyl accident and did not declare territories of their states contaminated with radiation and their residents being affected. They considered the Chernobyl addition to the gamma background level was so small that it was overlapped by a great margin with the natural radiation background. Therefore, people continue planting here, breeding cattle, and only a few of them recollect the alarming spring days of a quarter of a century ago. Natural radiation background varies from country to country. We have about 2.4 millisieverts a year here, but our Finnish friends have actually 7 in their country, and in Brazil at one resort they have around 10 because of the quality of their sand. There are also certain areas in France and India where this value is by several times greater than even that. There is nothing special about human beings living in conditions with a few extra millisieverts. Let's go back to the Red Forest. After a quarter century, there is still a high radiation background, but it didn't prevent it from becoming green again. Today, it is the perfect test site for the world's scientists to study the effects of small radiation doses on the fauna. The study subjects are local mouse-like rodents and shrews who are still affected by isotopes of cesium and strontium. The animals who have sacrificed their lives for science are carefully placed in storage tubes. It turns out that radiation neither affects the lifespan nor the reproductive capabilities of the tailed creatures. Phenotypically, we haven't found mutant mice or shrews, i.e. some apparent deviations of the animals. All of them had 4 legs, 2 eyes, and a tail, and so on. So really everything seems to be fine. However, an analysis of the blood of the animals who inhabit the state of Chernobyl has demonstrated a high chromosome break. Because of this, radiobiologists note that there is a very good adaptation amongst the fauna to the increased radiation conditions. This is Pripyat, the largest ghost city in the state of Chernobyl. You can clearly see the buildings of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant clearly in the vicinity of the city. If you walk in a straight line, it's just 3 kilometers to the plant. Well, this is perhaps the only city in the world whose residents left their homes unanimously within just a few hours. Now, it's difficult to believe it, but nearly 50,000 residents of Pripyat boarded buses, rail trains, riverboats, and left the city within just 3 hours. Without panicking, without crowding, without hysteria, families of nuclear workers who lived there understood what radiation truly is. This is the central library of the city of Pripyat. My feet step on thousands of books, Russian classical writers, children's literature, classics of Marxist-Leninism. It's not safe to read these books. Unseen radiation is still being emitted by their pages. Although the Chernobyl radiation turned out to be more dangerous for our consciousness as a society than for our health, it infected us with the so-called radiophobia, and these books have not a single line about it. The Chernobyl radiophobia has infected not only ordinary people, but also medical doctors. Many doctors recommended to pregnant women who left the seclusion zone to immediately get abortions. This was suggested even to young Kiev residents who lived 120 kilometers away from the explosion. At the moment of the accident, Dmitri's mother was in her 5th month. Tatiana Petrik resided 20 kilometers away from the plant. In Belarus, in the village of Kamarin, residents got word of the accident only 3 days later. Having left to go visit relatives in Ukraine, Tatiana right away was under medical surveillance. She got inspected by gynecologists several times. Yes, they were all recommended to get abortions, especially those who were in the early months of pregnancy. They were forced to get abortions. But I decided that if the baby had been conceived, it must be born. That's it. If the parents decided to give it life, this baby must live. And now you see this perfect guy sitting here. Well, that's that. This is a study the Japanese conducted of 200,000 people who survived the Hiroshima bombing. It shows that so far there has not been revealed a single inherent deformity, except for the retardation of one child due to an excessively small brain. This is perhaps the only defect that has been proven in international practice. But this is a rather rare defect with an occurrence frequency of 1 per several dozens of thousands of newborns. Dmitri's birthday is on August 28, 1986, nearly 4 months after the plant accident. They treated radiation with respect rather than fear. Therefore, no one was surprised when Dmitry decided to work at the Chernobyl plant, like his father. I looked at his experience and I got certain that there is actually nothing fearful about this Chernobyl plant. I also decided to try to make a life here myself. One more cause of the massive radiophobia, even with those who live thousands of kilometers away from Chernobyl, was the lack of credible information. The world got to know about the events in Chernobyl from the government of Sweden 2 days after, not from the government of the USSR. Nearly 1,000 kilometers away from Chernobyl, their nuclear people recorded an increased radiation level and calculated the plume path and alerted the world. Once again, the Soviet Union confirmed its nickname of the evil empire inside the country. The massive radiophobia was heated up by politicians who used Chernobyl's theme for their own personal interests. The most regrettable thing was, well, first the Chernobyl tragedy itself, and you know, I say this with sorrow, but also the politicians of 1989 and 1990, you know, they used this Chernobyl accident in their new form of parliament, which appeared, the People's Deputy Congress of the Supreme Soviets in Russia and the USSR. It was used by those who wanted to become an MP, to speak at rallies, shout out loud, and wear banners on their shoulders. Today is just impossible to put an information iron curtain around nuclear power plants. In Ukraine and in Russia, there is a global information system, ARMS. The internet users in real time are made aware of the radiation situation at nuclear facilities in the world. One can view data on Russia on the following website, russianatom.ru. Data from Pripyat around the Chernobyl plant soon will be available for anyone who wishes on the internet. Our PC is linked to a demo of the updated version of the Chernobyl plant's website. The ARM sensors say a radiation level in the southern districts of Pripyat is 0.2 microsieverts per hour. We decided to verify this information. Yevgeny, to what extent do these figures correspond to the real situation? Yes, they correspond quite well. My instrument here reads 0.2 microsieverts per hour also. This level of gamma radiation is close to the natural background levels. If they would have had this technology a quarter of a century ago, and anyone could have gone to trace radiation online, the radiophobia consequences could have been mitigated in our society. Specialists estimate that the psychosomatic consequences turned out to be much more severe than the radiation itself. As a result, we see people who are searching for their illnesses, who go to doctors and try to prove that their illness is because of a radiation effect. These people actually need to be treated by psychologists rather than by those who deal with radiation effects. Our attitudes toward Chernobyl just sort of trumpet the fact that we think about radiation as if it is the most dangerous thing with the worst impact. This is because of the Cold War period, when it looked like the atomic bombs were going to kill us all and that radiation would just destroy the world. So this fear of radiation led us to the ultimate evil, of allowing ourselves not to build nuclear power plants and to give nuclear technology in any form a bad name. Let's go back to the streets of lifeless Pripyat. In the past, this city was dubbed as an example of Soviet urban development. Wide streets, green parks, enormous sports facilities, cozy hotels. Everything was matching the most powerful nuclear plant in the USSR, the Chernobyl plant. It is a shame that today its name is associated with death and destruction and suffering, because 25 years ago it was the pride of the Soviet nuclear industry. It is not by chance that the plant was named after Russia's chief proletarian, Vladimir Lenin. The farther that Chernobyl sinks into the past, the more that one comes to understand how powerful the Soviet state was and how capable it was of dealing with the accident. If that accident would have happened just 5 years later, no one could have predicted what the consequences would have been. This is the goal of our trip, the capital of the state of Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant. As in any capital, it has its symbolic mausoleum. In the motherland, they call it a sarcophagus, but specialists term it Shelter 1. Under this reinforced concrete structure, there is a burnt-down fourth reactor of the plant. It is here where we will try to find answers to our main questions about just how dangerous the collapsed reactor is today, and whether another tragedy will happen in the future. A reminder of one of the most severe man-made catastrophes is the huge sarcophagus. Professionals call it the shelter facility. A dosimeter at even 200 meters away is still beeping wildly. Along these so-called cracks in the sarcophagus, the gamma levels here can exceed the natural background levels by up to 20 to 30 times. But those who work near the dead reactor don't get agitated by these numbers. I was going back after my vacation, and over a 4-hour flight, I received a greater dose than during a shelter inspection. Our crew is one of the few that were allowed to inspect inside the shelter. We had to change our clothes entirely. We put on sterile overalls, underwear, special wear, head caps, and leaf respirators. These protect us from the alpha and beta particles that are floating around. Speaking about devices that monitor accumulation of radioactivity, there are basically two detectors. The first one you are given when entering the seclusion zone. You get the second one when you enter the controlled access zone. It is about accumulation. As you can see, it reads only zeros now. We've just started our walk down. Let's see what numbers we'll read after the work is done. The way to the exploded fourth reactor is through the third one. Both reactors are in the same building, and their control systems are very similar. Since December of 2000, the third reactor has been shut down, its fuel removed, and its personnel have been very cautious about its slumber, tracing it all the while at the control panel. This is the control panel that started the experiment that ended up with an enormous explosion 25 years ago. Specialists estimate that the explosion was the equivalent of 2 tons of TNT. The test objective at the fourth reactor was to understand whether it was possible to use the reactor's kinetic energy for emergency power supply of all the safety systems. However, most skilled specialists, RBMK designers, and research institutes were not given the details of the test program. The program of that experiment was not approved by either the scientific supervisor or, so to speak, the architect general. NIKIT, in the first case, was not approved. We're in the turbine hall of the third reactor of the Chernobyl plant. This turbine is very similar to the fourth reactor, which participated in that doomed experiment 25 years ago. Attempts to use the kinetic energy of the turbines were made regularly at the plant during 1983 through 1985. They failed each time, and in the spring of 1986, the test program recorded it all. Late in the evening of April 25, 1986, the night shift of the fourth reactor started the experiment. As per program, the operator moved the reactor power down to 50%, but unexpectedly and inappropriately put it down to nearly zero. In all the procedures that existed then, it was written that if you have gone down, shut down the reactor, you must not raise its power again for 2 days, because there's a notion of the iodine well. In other words, there are great iodine absorption cross-sections which do not allow the chain reaction to start. So our creative man, when he got to the most difficult task, that being starting up the reactor from the iodine well, he succeeded in solving it. Today, not a single nuclear professional would ever imagine such a creative approach. Information about any deviation from the reactor norms of operation parameters immediately goes to the Situation and Crisis Center in Moscow. In the case of an emergency, the panel gathers within 2 hours, and this panel includes scientists, nuclear people, and EMERCOM's emergency experts. Each facility, a nuclear power plant, a radiochemical plant, a mining or chemical combine, machine engineering works, they're all within the system. When necessary, the panel of the crisis center goes to the scene. A caravan that includes many cars and jeeps used for radiation surveillance, satellite communications, and other special purpose communications can arrive at any region in Russia at any time. It takes no more than 1 hour to deploy the camp. So after a 30-minute walk through corridors, stairs led us up to the sacred room, the fourth reactor main control room. It looks like the moon. It's prohibited to take off our leaf respirators. All instruments and reactor control boards are still covered with a thin layer of radioactive dust. To understand whether it is possible for a tragedy like this to reoccur in the future, we need to not only look at the plant from the inside, but to also make several trips through time. For example, to find ourselves near the fourth reactor control panel, where in April of 1986 the tragedy occurred. So this is what is left of it. To revive the reactor and complete the test program, the personnel starts sequentially switching off other automatic safety systems. And the crucial thing, practically all of the control rods are withdrawn from the reactor core. An RBMK core consists of several hundreds of zirconium channels within the graphite stack. Each channel holds a fuel assembly with uranium. All fuel assemblies are washed under a pressure of 90 atmospheres. The nuclear reaction is controlled by the reactor control and protection rods, which absorb neutrons. There should be about 30 control rods for the reactor to operate stably. So the operators managed to raise the reactor power up by 10% only, instead of 50% as required by the test program. However, the deadly experiment was decided to be ran even in spite of the reactor's unstable operation. There were 0 to 2 rods in total, just that. In other words, the reactor was beyond control, and when you operate it in this mode, it's like driving a car having left the steering wheel and brakes. Naturally, the catastrophe was inevitable, and it's no wonder why it happened. First, it was a blast right over the ceiling of the main control room. Even it couldn't be called a blast. I had never heard the sound before all the things. So I thought that those could be water hammers in the generators and wanted to take the appropriate actions. After that, a huge impact took place. Cracking of load-bearing columns. Yeah, I could hear that all. The forced ventilation gasped with dust momentarily. I thought, I couldn't tell whether it was real or just a dream. The State Commission issued a statement saying the explosion took place due to grave breaches of the procedures and a failure to observe the safety regimes during the operation of the Unit 4 reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. They say that one major systemic error was the transfer of all nuclear power plants in the Soviet Union in the mid-1970s from the jurisdiction of the Minsk-Red-Mash, which designed, built, and operated them in the 1950s and 60s, to the Ministry of Energy. It was a transition from rigorous, nearly military-style requirements of the personnel to regulations that were like general business ways of doing things. This laissez-faire attitude doomed the world to a catastrophe. The reactor is featuring the after-action, so to speak. It doesn't matter what physical or thermal processes are there. These are details, but it is, it's not like some boiler. There's no fire at the bottom of the heater. You just shut the burner and that's all. When one studies the details of recorders of evidence provided by witnesses carefully, it turns out that science is also wrong. When they were defending the reactor, it was like simultaneously pressing the brakes and the gas, because it was a positive reactivity when the rods were inserted, i.e. the reactor was speeding up, but then it was set as a brake, so that speeding up was enough to run off the reactor with prompt neutrons. All experts are unanimous that the Chernobyl accident was an upheaval in the national nuclear industry. The protection against ill-thought actions of the personnel has become one of the main design principles of the reactors. As to the RBMKs, a number of control rods have been increased from 30 to 70. That has excluded the prompt runoff of the reactor if it stops abruptly. If before the accident the RBMKs were fueled with uranium dioxide, after upgrades they would have been fed with uranium erbium fuel. Erbium is an efficient neutron absorber, and these neutrons are responsible for the nuclear reaction speed. The slower and more even fuel burnup reduces the risk of unstable operations of of each channel reduces, the slower and more even the fuel burns up. Also, a response speed of the reactor's emergency protection has been increased. Previously, it took up to 17 seconds to kill the nuclear reaction. Now the control rod drop time just depends on the force of gravity itself. The emergency protection rods, which drop from the top, they go to the bottom within 2 to 2.5 seconds. Over this time period, the reactor power drops to 0. Automatic functions have been completely replaced at upgraded reactors. So today, a reactor of this type and power capacity is operating at the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now it's completely made up of digital electronics. Today, power units are controlled by potent processors rather than by operators. Human error has been minimalized. Yes, in fact, we placed operators within rigorous arrangements. The old systems didn't provide. They're quite smart today. They are digital chip controlled with appropriate software. But the algorithms that are built in there are actually specifically designed to avoid the free will of the operators. When you travel along the empty corridors of Unit 4, you find many historic things. There are traces of daily heroism of the liquidators. Some of them, Chernobyl plant employees, try to keep them as museum relics. During the repair of this place, near the main control board of Unit 4, the plant workers argue whether the inscriptions left on the liquidation time should be removed. For example, there is an inscription date of June 1986. At that time, the radiation level was 0.2 roentgens per hour. That is 1,000 times greater than the 2011 level. People often try to avoid this topic, but Chernobyl has become a unique scientific test range for international scientists. Many safety-ensuring technologies of nuclear power were test run exactly on this territory, the State of Chernobyl. When the reactor core melts, and in our case it didn't melt, it flew to bits, it's because uranium is heavy and heated up to a high temperature. That's the thing that melts through. It can melt through whatever you want, and we were afraid of this at the time because the Pripyat River is nearby, and the Dnieper is close, and there is the Black Sea beyond that. So the real danger of the first day of the accident was that nuclear magma fuel could get into the groundwater. Nuclear physicists were asked to go to Chernobyl. Calculations were done by scientists showing that the probability of the radioactive materials actually melting through was insignificantly low. But commanders of the liquidation actions decided to be 100% sure this wouldn't happen. For 40 days, a tunnel was dug under the plant's foundation, and a concrete plate of 30 by 30 meters was installed in this area. Piping was laid inside the plate so that cooling water could be supplied to it at all times. Thankfully, the nuclear magma didn't go beyond the plant's boundaries, but one functional principle of safety has been learned due to this process. This is the so-called core melt trap. When the reactor vessel bottom melts down through, the reactor magma gets into a special cooled concrete mug. It is filled with a sacrificial material, which reduces the melting temperature from 2,500 degrees Celsius to 1,700 degrees Celsius. The trap design ensures continuous cooling of the melted materials and prevents it from ruining the reactor building enclosure. Over the past quarter of a century, several generations have altered not only in our society, but in the reactor building as well. The new nuclear units in Russia are fitted with water-to-water reactors of the Generation 3+ type. Blackout absorber rods can drop by gravity into the core within 2 seconds. After the chain reaction has been shut down, the most important thing is to cool the reactor and fuel rods. If the coolant leaks away, the reactor is supplied with water from the emergency water tanks delivered by the emergency cool-down pump. pumps. Power is supplied independently from diesel generators. To prevent radioactive substances from exiting the power unit boundaries, there is a container. It is a double-wall reinforced concrete dome about 2 meters thick. It is capable of withstanding an internal pressure of 7 atmospheres per 2 square centimeters and a temperature of up to 200 degrees Celsius. The dome remains leak-tight even under a magnitude 8 earthquake or a jet fighter crash directly on it. Sprayed water condenses steam, and special admixtures bound radioactive isotopes and prevent their propagation. The power unit can remain in such a stable state for nearly 3 days. The accident in the territory of the state of Chernobyl has substantially advanced nuclear and radiation technology. Many of the safety regulations have been revised. The events in Chernobyl expedited the development of nuclear medicine, which today saves millions of human lives across the world. These techniques and technology and understanding all are derived from very dangerous roots. In Chernobyl, Nikolai Tarakanov led activities to remove most of the dangerous radioactive elements from the plant's territory while commanding the collection of the graphite innards of the reactor. He received a large exposure of radiation, up to 2,000 millisieverts, while the approved one for the liquidators was at the very most 250. At the time, gamma radiation on the roof of the neighboring building of Unit 3 exceeded the natural background levels by up to 40 million times. Each volunteer worked for no more than 3 minutes in special lead armor. They gave me a dosimeter. They gave one to everybody. We put on a shield made of plexiglass to protect our faces from burns by the beta radiation. Then came a rubber-plated apron, leaded gloves, the heaviest stuff possible, high boots made of lead, and naturally lead underwear. They selected only the strongest guys. The shielding weighed 30 kilograms, and you had to work with it by hand. Owing to the well-designed individual protection systems, none of the 3,500 volunteers fell sick to radiation poisoning. And Nikolai continues fighting the consequences of radiation, but not in himself, but in Ukraine, Russia, and even the USA. He's going to celebrate his 77th birthday in May. His heroism is now part of history, but not because there are no heroes. It is because society has changed. Attitudes toward human life have changed. An example is the stabilizatsiya, or stabilization project. In essence, it has saved the sarcophagus from degrading, and it's extended the sarcophagus's life for 15 more years. As per 2 decades ago, the work was performed in difficult conditions on the site. Before each operation inside the sarcophagus, the most dangerous one, the builders did a drill, like in the army. We drilled basic skills to act in an extremely complex operation using specially built mock-ups. Both Russia and Ukraine hadn't a single liquidator after that work. One of the paradoxes of the state of Chernobyl is that the greater the dose the liquidators of the plant received, the calmer about radiation they tended to be. Alexander Drobat commanded the rebuilding of the engineering utilities near the sarcophagus. He received his permitted dose of 250 millisieverts over 1 month, though the dose, an unrecorded one, was 3 times higher. They say small doses are safe in limited quantities. Thus, if I got into a high radiation fields, it's clear. I'll tell you a simple joke dating back all the way to 1986. 2 deceased men meet in heaven. One was from Pripyat, and the other one used to live in Kiev. The latter asks the one who was from Pripyat, "How'd you get here? Why?" And he answers, "Well, you know, it's radiation. I've died of radiation." And then the Pripyat man asks the Kiev guy, "And what about you?" "My case information," he answers. Jokes are jokes, but specialists consider radiophobia the key damaging factor of the Chernobyl accident. The official report of the IAEA on the 20th anniversary of the accident says that the problems of mental health create more hazard than radiation does. For example, many people still believe that nearly all 600,000 of the liquidators received deadly radiation doses. An average dose of that cohort of liquidators of 1986 was about 150 millisieverts. In other words, it's one order of magnitude less than the dose which can trigger radiation sickness. Therefore, it is not a matter of the radiation. Therefore, this is no matter of radiation sickness. This information is confirmed by the specialists of the National Radiation and Epidemiological Registrar. The database of this most capable information center contains information about 700,000 citizens of Russia. Of them, about 200,000 are members of the liquidation crew. The remainder are those who are in contaminated territories. In this group of liquidators, we have an excess by 3% as to solid cancers and a higher frequency of leukosis. We don't see a discrepancy between the number of fatalities for the liquidators and the surveyed patients overall. To date, about 40,000 of the 200,000 liquidators have died. And these numbers correspond with the average projections for fatality statistics amongst males in Russia. Discussions are still on about the direct casualties of the Chernobyl accident. Some count hundreds, even millions of those who died. Angelina Guskova personally received the first people affected by the accident in the 6th hospital, which was at the time well known across the Soviet Union. She cared for them and helped them regain their health. She has been tracing each Chernobyl radiation sickness patient for over 25 years. In the early days, 27 people died in the hospital. Then there were 2 more, one in the first aid station, and 29 were killed by fallen structures. And later, during 25 years of living, 24 people died. Of those who survived, there are 134 sick people. Those 24 people died of different causes, including the youngest one, our strongest grief, the very young man who we treated, cured, but he later died of alcoholism. Among the population of affected territories, an exposure dose over the past 25 years has not exceeded 20 millisieverts in total. Scientists have not found prominent effects for health in the region over the last quarter of a century. The only exclusion is the southwest of the Bryansk region. The Chernobyl fallout brought radioactive iodine there. At the time, about 200 children got thyroid cancer, but medicine found the cure and saved the lives of nearly all the little patients. We didn't lose a single child because of cancer. Secondly, all children live their normal lives. We did a comprehensive treatment, a surgery, and radioiodine therapy. Today, the children receive small doses of L-thyroxine pellets. The main thing is that they live normal lives, get married, and have families. The border again, the border of the state of Chernobyl. We crossed it together with the chief radiation safety expert of the plant. After being at the sarcophagus so long, we have to prove that we can meet the guidelines to exit and will be checked by sensitive electronics. Thankfully, the alpha and beta particles were all left behind in the special territory. When leaving the country, we try to pick up a souvenir for good memories. In the state of Chernobyl, souvenirs are prohibited. The radiometer records any contamination. Therefore, in this state, it's better to rely on a camera or human memory. The commuter train, it is one more path to get into and out of the seclusion zone. There is only one path to Slavutich, the city which was built for the Chernobyl nuclear workers after the accident. This is the place where, after an hour of journey, it becomes clear how our society has changed over a quarter of a century, and nuclear power along with it. At this stage of society's development, especially, there is no alternative to nuclear. It is really needed now. I'm saying not as a nuclear worker, but as a person who got used to a certain level of comfort. Are we ready now to abandon the internet and cell phones, lighten our apartments? It's clear that the hydrocarbon power generation process doesn't provide the capacities that would give us this level of comfort.
Thousands of people, at least in the United States, have health effects and have early death as a result of emissions that are put out by coal plants. Hydropower has its risk. It's every few years we hear about a dam bursting and flooding a city and killing people. And my personal view is that a strong country should rely upon a whole basket of energy sources. It should have a mix so that basically one doesn't become a hostage to any one particular source.
This is the end of our tour to the state of Chernobyl, leaving behind the commuter train which carries thousands of people to the plant every day to work. And we ask ourselves, why do these people every day risk their health to go to the most dangerous plant in the world? I don't know, but it seems to me that we have succeeded in finding the answers to our questions. Certainly, it is not a well-paying job, but that is not the main thing. The main thing is that it is a job that will be remembered by our posterity, and it is a job that will sooner or later rebreathe life into the Chernobyl forest.